As we begin our descent into the bottom 5 movies of the year, we get an unfortunate reminder that Megamind wasn't the only childhood icon to be desecrated in 2024. Number 5 is Saving Bikini Bottom, the Sandy Cheeks movie. Now, much like with Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate, this is another movie that I feel bad for putting this low on the list. Most of what I said about Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate could very easily apply to this movie as well. Is this movie worse than Joker 2 and Megalopolis? Yes. Yes, it is, but it feels too obvious that it's worse than those movies. Like, it's just, no duh, this is worse than Joker 2. It's such low-hanging fruit, it's such an easy target that I can't help but feel a little bit bad for putting this below real movies, when, much like Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate, this is generic low-budget straight-to-streaming slop made for babies. At the same time, though, what the is this movie? This is not SpongeBob. I don't know what this is, but it's not SpongeBob. In order for you to truly understand why this movie is bad, let me explain to y'all why SpongeBob is so beloved. At least like the older SpongeBob episodes, the first 3 seasons. Saving Bikini Bottom, when compared to most SpongeBob media, yes, even outside of the pre-movie seasons, feels a lot more dumbed down for kids. You watch this movie and it's very obvious watching it that this is made for an extremely young demographic. And okay, one could argue that this isn't necessarily a bad thing, except for the fact that SpongeBob in its early days had this universal appeal to it. Anyone of any age could watch the older SpongeBob episodes and they would find them funny because they're just that well written. They're that funny. This is the exact same problem that I had with Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate. The first Megamind could appeal to anyone of any age. Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate is only for really young kids. And as I mentioned before, the target audience for Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate is really confusing. It feels too dumbed down for kids to be enjoyed by the teens and adults that grew up with the original Megamind all the way back in 2010. But today's kids don't know what the hell Megamind is, so they're not going to enjoy this movie that is supposed to be a sequel to a very niche animated movie from almost 15 years ago. Saving Bikini Bottom suffers a similar problem. Most of the people that love SpongeBob nowadays are teens and adults that grew up with the show during its golden age in the early 2000s. This is a movie that completely lacks that appeal. It is a movie made for very, very young children. But here's the problem. Nickelodeon, I don't know if you know this, but kids don't watch SpongeBob nowadays. Kids don't care about SpongeBob. Skibbity Toilet is their SpongeBob. SpongeBob is supposed to be something that anyone of any age can enjoy. And yet this movie just feels like a bastardized Cocomelon version of SpongeBob. What the hell is this? This is not SpongeBob. You watch this movie and it just has this very shell of its former self feel to it. Like, yeah, it has all of the SpongeBob characters that we know and love, and yet it just doesn't feel the same. The movie focuses on Sandy and SpongeBob traveling to the real world in order to save all of Bikini Bottom. I don't think I brought this up in my original review for this movie, but by this point, the idea of SpongeBob entering the real world no longer feels fresh or special. It was great in the first movie because it was a brand new concept at the time. The idea of seeing SpongeBob and Patrick in the real world. It was good in the second movie as well, not to the same extent, but it was still good. I'm well aware of the criticisms surrounding Sponge Out of Water. The fact that the trailers heavily marketed the real world scenes when in reality they only happened for like the last 15 to 20 minutes of the movie. Most of the movie is 2D animated and it takes place underwater. I think Sponge on the Run had a real world segment, but I think it was like a dream sequence. It didn't actually happen. It had like I think Snoop Dogg was in it, and it had like Keanu Reeves as a tumbleweed. I don't know. I don't care. I'm counting it. I don't care. And now here we have our fourth consecutive SpongeBob movie that features these characters going into the real world. And by this point, it doesn't feel fresh, it doesn't feel special, it doesn't feel surprising anymore. This movie also contains another tired plot formula that these SpongeBob movies have, as most of the movie consists of SpongeBob and Sandy traveling to this water park laboratory place that has Bikini Bottom in it. I go into more detail about it in the review, okay? As we all know, the first SpongeBob movie was primarily a road trip movie that focused on SpongeBob and Patrick traveling to Shell City in order to get King Neptune's crown. The third movie had SpongeBob and Patrick going to Atlantic City, I think. I don't know, it was like a stupid pun like that, in order to save Gary. And now here we are with this movie, with another fucking road trip plot. Somehow the second movie, they were able to come up with a different plot for it, a unique plot. And then for the next two movies, they're like, nah, let's just reuse the road trip plot that the first movie had. I mean, okay, I gotta be a little bit more fair to this movie. The previous three SpongeBob movies before this were all proper theatrical quality movies. This, again, is like a cheap, low-budget streaming movie for Netflix. But my point still stands. The main villain of this movie apparently worked with Sandy back when she lived in Texas before moving to Bikini Bottom. And so she wants to take all of the residents of Bikini Bottom and turn them into toys, I guess. It's supposed to be like a commentary on consumerism. I don't know. It feels highly out of place for a movie like this, and it also feels highly ironic given the way Nickelodeon has treated SpongeBob for quite a long time now. Oh yeah, Sandy's family is also introduced in this movie, and they're like, whatever, they're characters that exist, I don't care. The main problem with this movie is that it just doesn't feel like SpongeBob. I know it's cliche to say that SpongeBob nowadays isn't as good as it used to be, but like, watching this movie, you really get that feel that like, yeah, this isn't the same SpongeBob that I grew up with. What the is this? I honest to God think this is the lowest point in the entire SpongeBob series. I could very easily imagine, you know, I'm sure if there's any parents watching this video, I'm sure you've had a situation where it's like your son or your daughter wants to watch something with you. And so, against your will, to make your kid happy, you decide to watch the thing with them. Most of the time, I want to imagine you're just pretending to enjoy what your kid wants you to watch just to make them happy. But maybe there's moments where it's like you can genuinely enjoy watching something with your kid. If your kid wants to watch Barney with you, for example, I want to imagine it's going to be like you just pretend to enjoy Barney. But then something like Golden Age SpongeBob, that could be something that like, yeah, you can enjoy it as well. You and your kid could enjoy Golden Age SpongeBob. You and your kid could enjoy the first SpongeBob movie. You and your kid could enjoy seasons 4 and 5 of SpongeBob, because those seasons, they have a lot of great episodes in them as well. The best episodes from these two seasons, Krusty Towers, Roller Cowards, Crabs a la Mode, Dunces and Dragons, Friend or Foe, you know, people could enjoy those episodes, regardless of age. They're still funny episodes that have a lot of things to enjoy about them. This movie, in comparison, is like your kid forces you to watch it with them, and it's like maybe they could get a tiny bit of enjoyment out of it because they're a stupid 3-year-old who doesn't know any better. But it's going to be a painful movie to sit through. It's going to be hard to pretend that you're enjoying the movie that you're watching. That's not what SpongeBob should be like. SpongeBob should be enjoyed by anyone of any age. SpongeBob is supposed to be funny. this movie is not funny. If you're over the age of 5, this movie is not funny to you at all. Everything just feels so generic and babyish, a far cry from what SpongeBob used to be. Again, I feel bad for criticizing this movie given the fact that it's such an easy target movie, but this is a genuinely hard movie to sit through, and I feel that number 5 is the most appropriate place for me to put this movie. All I'm gonna say is, at the very least, they managed to slightly redeem themselves with the Plankton movie that came out recently. A movie that is, mind you, still not very good, still a massive far cry from what SpongeBob used to be, and it still has this dumbed down for babies feel. It doesn't have that universal appeal that old SpongeBob had, and yet it is a considerably better, considerably more tolerable movie than the Sandy Cheeks movie. You're almost able to forgive the generic baby movie feel of the Plankton movie. And for what it's worth, there are a couple redeeming qualities about the Plankton movie. Not enough to make it good, but enough to make it better than the Sandy Cheeks movie. What an insult to the SpongeBob series. I have no shame in saying that this is the lowest point in the SpongeBob franchise. I genuinely think that this is a lower point for SpongeBob than a Pal for Gary or One Course Meal. I don't care what anyone says. And with that, let us move on to number 4. Number 4 is... okay, I have a lot of stuff to say about number 4, so let's just dive right into it. Number 4 is Emilia Perez. Okay, let me give you a chronological timeline. So this movie came out sometime around the latter half of 2024 onto Netflix. I knew literally nothing about this movie, except I saw that reviews for it were not that good. But I didn't think much of it. I just thought, another crappy Netflix original movie. The sky is blue, grass is green, what else is new? And then, in January, the nominations for the 97th Academy Awards were announced, where this movie received a whopping 13, yes, 13 Oscar nominations, including for Best Picture. And it was around that time where I saw more and more people ridiculing this movie. The hate for this movie began to grow a lot more. By this time, I had already finalized my list. I had already found all of the movies that I wanted to talk about on this list, and I'd already placed them where I wanted to place them. But given how highly controversial and hated this movie became all of a sudden, I knew I couldn't make a video on the worst movies of 2024 without acknowledging this movie in some way, shape, or form. And so originally I had this movie as a dishonorable mention. And then, on the exact day that the Oscars were held, morbid curiosity got the best of me, and so I decided, you know what, let me go and watch this movie and see what the big deal is. I have this rule when it comes to making these lists where if I've never seen the movie, regardless of its reception, I cannot add it onto the best list or onto the worst list or anything like that. But I wanted to make an exception for this movie and include it as a dishonorable mention, just because even though supposedly this movie was really bad, it managed to get 13 Oscar nominations. Just so you know, Lord of the Rings: Return of the King is another movie that received 13 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, which it won. And Return of the King is considered one of the greatest movies ever made. This movie is considered hot garbage. Here I was only a few hours before the Oscars started, and I watched the movie. And I've gotta say, holy shit, y'all were not lying. This movie is bad. I went into this movie expecting it to be a comedy of some kind. This movie is a musical. A really bad musical, unsurprisingly. But there was one song in particular in this movie that received a ton of ridicule online. And I'm sure you know exactly which song I'm talking about. I'm sure you're all well aware of that one lyric in this one song that was the subject of constant ridicule all around the internet. Now, I was familiar with this one song in the movie, and this song has like a very like campy comedic feel to it, and it made me think the whole movie would have this like campy feel to it. Imagine my shock when I find out no, that's not the case. Most of the movie takes itself very seriously. Most of the movie is played out in a serious tone. And then out of nowhere, you have this one musical number in it that like feels very campy and comedic. And much like with Megalopolis, I have to ask myself, am I watching a fucking Adam Sandler comedy, or am I watching a movie that was nominated for 13 Oscars, including Best Picture? I thought there was a small chance that this movie could be funny bad. It's not. It's not funny bad at all. This one musical number is the only remotely funny bad moment in the entire movie. The rest of the movie, as I mentioned before, plays out to be very serious. It tries to be serious. Despite the constant ridicule surrounding this movie, despite the many controversies surrounding it, nothing, I repeat, nothing could have prepared me for how fucking boring this movie is. This movie focuses on a cartel leader who wants to retire from the cartel and transition into a woman, starting a new life subsequently. And so she gets this like journalist newswoman to help her out transitioning. I don't know. The cartel leader who transitions into a woman is the titular Emilia Perez, and she also has a family. And for some reason, I don't know, maybe they explained this in the movie, but I wasn't paying attention to it because this movie is boring as hell. Emilia doesn't want her family to know about her transitioning. Before she transitions into a woman, she says goodbye to her family, who are sent to like Switzerland, Sweden, I don't know. And then she undergoes the surgery to become a woman, while also simultaneously faking her death. And so, as Emilia Perez, she tries to present herself as like an aunt, I believe. It's a really fucking stupid story. I genuinely cannot remember if the movie explains why Emilia Perez doesn't want her family to know that she transitioned and that she faked her death. Oh yeah, it's around this time where I want to acknowledge the controversy surrounding the actress that plays Emilia Perez. So I believe shortly after it was announced that this movie received 13 Oscar nominations, a bunch of old tweets from the actress that plays Emilia Perez would resurface, where she was exposed for saying like really racist stuff about Muslims and George Floyd and a bunch of other stuff, I believe. And all that did was add even more fuel to the fire. All that did was make the movie into even more of a laughingstock than it already was. The tone of this movie is all over the damn place. As I mentioned before, you have that one song, the infamous song, that feels very campy and out of place given the rest of the movie is more serious in comparison. But actually, almost all of the songs feel this way. The movie tries to be taken seriously, it tries to be dramatic and whatever, and then out of nowhere it'll hit you with a musical number that sounds like I'm watching a Disney movie or something like that. None of the other songs in this movie have that comedic campy tone that that one song has, but they also don't fit in with the tone that this movie is trying to have. I have to remind myself, this movie is not a comedy. It's not even like a comedy drama. That's kind of what I expected it to be. This movie is purely a drama, and it's a really bad drama. And unfortunately, it's not an unintentionally funny drama or anything like that. Again, there is nothing funny bad about this movie. Nothing funny bad at all. I've seen a lot of people say that this movie poorly portrays Mexican culture and trans culture, and I would love to go into more detail on how this movie represents those cultures, but unfortunately, I'm not Mexican, nor am I trans. I'm sure there are Mexican people and trans people that have reviewed this movie, and they could go into better detail on how this movie represents those two cultures. I'm just gonna acknowledge that, yeah, this movie portrays both cultures poorly, and that's it. I would love to elaborate on how it portrays both cultures poorly, but Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with either culture myself, ironically enough, so I don't want to, start a controversy. I don't want to criticize the movie for misrepresenting both cultures and then misrepresent both cultures myself. This movie heavily focuses on Mexican culture, which is really ironic because this is a French movie. This movie was made by a French director. There are 0 Mexican actors in this movie, which sparked a huge backlash among the Mexican community. And according to the director of this movie, the reason as to why there are no Mexican actors in this movie is because he couldn't find Mexican actors that were talented enough for this movie, which only added even more backlash. If I recall correctly, this movie wasn't even being filmed in Mexico. I don't know about that, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. It's a movie that heavily focuses on Mexican culture. It poorly represents Mexican culture. It's made by a French man, and it doesn't have any Mexican actors in it. I wouldn't be surprised if the movie wasn't even filmed in Mexico, honestly. I don't know how the hell this movie was nominated for 13 Oscars. I mean, the good news is, it only won 2 Oscars out of 13. It would have been better if it won 0 Oscars, but you know what? At least there were more Oscars that it lost compared to Oscars that it won, so, try and make the most out of this kind of situation. The 2 Oscars that it won for were Best Supporting Actress for Zoe Saldana, I think is how you pronounce her name. I apologize if I mispronounce her name. And I mean, I guess she's okay. I guess her performance in this movie is okay. I don't know about, the competition. I don't know who else was nominated for Best Supporting Actress, but I guess, this movie is garbage, but I guess she was okay. I don't know. And then this movie won Best Original Song, which is absolutely fucking ridiculous because every song in this movie is hot garbage. The song that won wasn't that song, but it was instead another song that is just as terrible. And besides that, there were no other Oscar wins for this movie. Thank God for that. But I'm still amazed at how a movie this bad, a movie this boring, could be nominated for an Oscar, let alone 13 Oscars. How the hell was this movie nominated for Best Picture? I mean, obviously, it didn't win Best Picture, thankfully, but just the idea that the people that run the Oscars looked at this movie and they thought, yeah, this had a chance of winning Best Picture. This was considered worthy to win Best Picture, potentially, is crazy to me, especially when you look at the movies that came out in 2024 that weren't nominated for Best Picture. And as a matter of fact, some of these movies didn't receive any acknowledgement at all at the Oscars. How the hell did this movie get 13 Oscar nominations, but then a movie like Challengers, which is a amazing movie, that got 0 Oscar nominations? That is crazy to me. How the hell was this movie nominated for Best Picture over Challengers, over I Saw the TV Glow, over Furiosa, over The Wild Robot? Listen, I'm not one of those animationist cinema people, okay? I'm not saying this from an animationist cinema perspective. I've moved on from that bullcrap a long time ago, but I'm saying this from the perspective of this is a movie that everyone says is really good. Everyone can agree that, yeah, The Wild Robot is a damn good movie, one of the best movies of 2024. Everyone agrees with that, right? Right. And so you have this movie that everyone agrees is one of the best movies of 2024, and you would think it would be nominated for Best Picture because of that, right? Wrong. Instead, this far more controversial, polarizing movie gets nominated for Best Picture instead. Actually, I don't even know if polarizing is the right word to describe this movie. Polarizing implies that there are tons of people that hate this movie, but there are also just as many people that love this movie, which is not the case at all. I have never seen anyone defend this movie. I have never seen anyone say this movie is good. At best, I've seen people say this movie isn't as bad as everyone makes it out to be, but it's still not a good movie. It's mid, it's okay, whatever. The bottom line is, I've never seen anyone say this movie is good. So how the hell this movie got nominated for Best Picture is a mystery to me. Could you imagine if this movie won Best Picture instead of Anora? I've never seen Anora. I'm sure it's a good movie. Actually, of the 10 movies that were nominated for Best Picture, excluding Emilia Perez, I've only seen 3 of them. Dune 2, A Complete Unknown, and Wicked. I thought Dune 2 was the best movie of the year, and so that was my pick for Best Picture. I also thought A Complete Unknown was a fantastic movie though, so I wouldn't have minded if it won instead. I don't think Wicked is Best Picture material at all, but you know, at least it wouldn't have been Emilia Perez. At least Emilia Perez wouldn't have won. So, you know, I guess I'd be fine with it. At the end of the day, Anora won Best Picture and not Emilia Perez. And so, more likely than not, Emilia Perez will just fade away into obscurity. I don't see this becoming an infamous bad movie like The Room or Birdemic, especially considering the fact that, again, this movie is not funny bad like those 2 movies. You know, with all of the controversy surrounding this movie, I was expecting it to be offensively bad or hilariously bad, and what I end up getting instead is one of the most boring movies I've ever seen in my entire life. Now that the Oscars have ended, there's a very high chance that this movie will be rightfully forgotten about, never to be seen or heard from ever again. And that's my cue to move on to number 3. Number 3 was the first movie that I watched in 2024, and in retrospect, I should have looked at that as the first red flag that 2024 wasn't going to be all that good of a year when it came to movies. Number 3 is Argylle. Now, I have a funny story. I originally had this movie up way high on the list. This was originally going to be around like number 11 or so. I made a video on this movie where I proclaimed it to be the worst movie of 2024 already. And then I subsequently watched Madam Web and Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate, which I would also make videos on, and I would declare those movies to be worse than Argylle. And then, when the time came for me to work on this list, I rewatched this movie. This was another movie on this list that I decided to rewatch. I thought this movie was bad the first time I watched it. I remember walking out of the theater thinking, what the f*** did I just watch? What the hell was this? But I saw how much more poor quality these 2 movies were, and I guess it made me think that this movie wasn't that bad in comparison. And then I rewatched this movie for this list, and holy shit, this movie is genuinely so much worse than I remember it being. I mean this from the bottom of my heart when I say that this is probably the most pretentious movie I've ever seen, and one of the most headache-inducing movies I've ever seen. Some of you might be wondering, why am I ranking this lower than the similarly pretentious and hard-to-understand Megalopolis? Well, you see, the difference between these 2 movies is that Megalopolis at least has kind of an excuse to be pretentious. Megalopolis is an artsy-fartsy movie that may or may not be We Live in a Society from a famous director that peaked all the way back in the 70s. Argylle is a action comedy. This is a movie that you're supposed to find funny. You're supposed to have fun watching this movie. And that makes the pretentious, confusing nature of this movie's storyline even worse than it already is. This is a movie that's just filled to the brim with different plot twists. This is like a heavy, like, spy-related movie. And so I guess, yeah, obviously there would be plot twists all over. But the problem is, there are way too many plot twists in this movie. And I mean way too many, to the point where you have to wonder, like, what the hell is this? It feels like I'm watching an entire trilogy's worth of movie ideas crammed into one singular movie. Director Matthew Vaughn states that he intends on making this movie into a trilogy. Yeah, well, good luck with that. I think you've used up every idea for this trilogy in this first movie. And given how this movie performed critically and commercially, that sequel is never gonna can happen. Good luck with that, Matthew. Good luck. Imagine if, like, the Star Wars original trilogy. Imagine if Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi never existed, and instead everything that happened in those movies happened in A New Hope, and that includes the events of A New Hope itself. All of a sudden, Star Wars becomes this insanely bloated movie that is impossible to follow, impossible to understand. Just like that, Star Wars is not the big cultural phenomenon that it is today. That's what it's like with this movie. There are way too many concepts in this movie's storyline for it to work as a singular movie. This feels like something that, like, they have a first movie and they could very easily cut it into a second movie. They have, like, a lot of stuff that they could just put into the sequel, and then for some reason Matthew Vaughn's like, nah, let's just put it all into this one movie. It. And what we end up getting is one of the most headache-inducing movies I've ever seen in my entire life. I went into this movie expecting a simple dumb fun action comedy. There are dumb fun moments in the movie, but they're not enough to save it, and you cannot enjoy these moments because you know that they're only temporary. I went into this movie expecting something similar to 2022's Bullet Train, which I think is one of the most underrated movies of the 2020s so far. Bullet Train is a fun action comedy. It's loads of fun. It has a lot of characters in it, but it doesn't feel bloated or confusing or anything like that. And so I went into this movie expecting it to be something kind of similar to Bullet Train. And what I end up getting is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. And I can't even imagine what it would be like to, like, watch this movie based on the trailers. The trailers do not tell you at all how bloated this movie is. Imagine watching the trailer for this movie and you think, oh, this looks like a funny movie. We don't really get a lot of funny movies in this day and age, Everything nowadays is MCU this and A24 that, finally we get a comedy in this day and age. And so you go and see this movie expecting it to be a throwback to a better time when we had movies like Hot Fuzz and Tropic Thunder coming out, and so you expect this to be like a modern day, like, counterpart to those movies. You expect this to be the modern day equivalent to these movies, and what you end up getting instead is a movie that's pretentious as hell, confusing as hell, bloated as hell. It's not a very funny movie, so even if the first 3 issues weren't there, the movie still wouldn't be all that good. And the few dumb fun moments that are in this movie, again, you can't have much fun watching them because you know that they're temporary moments. You know that eventually these few fun action scenes that are in the movie, they're temporary, and then the movie will go back to being confusing as hell with its storyline. Alright, I think I've delayed the inevitable long enough. Allow me to try and explain the plot of this movie without having this segment last 5 hours long. The movie begins with Ellie Conway, played by Bryce Dallas Howard, an author best known for the popular Argyle book series. As she plans a trip to visit her family to help her write the final book in the series, she meets Aiden, played by Sam Rockwell, who tries to help Ellie escape from the train that they're currently on as it's been infiltrated. As it turns out, the secret organization that Ellie writes about in her Argyle series actually exists, with the leader of the organization being played by Bryan Cranston, who I'm just gonna say is unironically the best thing about this movie. The cast in general do try to save this movie a bit, but unfortunately they're not enough, but Bryan Cranston especially is great as the villain of this movie. I'm not even just saying that because haha Walter White jokes or anything like that. No, genuinely, he is the best part of the movie. The cast in general is really good. I mean, this movie has a packed cast, seriously, which I want to imagine contributed to the massive budget that this movie has, but I'll get into that later on. Bryce Dallas Howard, Sam Rockwell, Samuel L. Jackson, Bryan Cranston, Henry Cavill, John Cena, Dua Lipa. Well, actually, I don't know about that one. Dua Lipa's barely in the movie. Her character appears at the very beginning within the Argyle book universe, and she dies almost immediately. It's a cameo, essentially. You know what, though? This just made me realize something. FKA Twigs in The Crow. Lady Gaga in Joker 2, Selena Gomez in Emilia Perez, and now Dua Lipa in Argyle. If I had a nickel for every time there was a bad 2024 movie that had a female musician star in it, I would have 4 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's really weird that it happened 4 times, don't you think? Honestly, it's kind of a miracle that Ariana Grande somehow managed to avoid joining this club. But I'm getting off topic. Ellie and Aiden travel to London to find something. I don't remember at all. And I guess they end up finding it. And then this is when we get our first plot twist of sorts for this movie. At a hotel, Ellie overhears Aiden talking on the phone, talking about how Ellie has been annoying him throughout this whole mission to the point where he wants to strangle her and stuff like that, which ends up scaring Ellie. She promptly runs away to her family. As it turns out though, this was all a misunderstanding. Aiden was talking to Alfie, Samuel L. Jackson's character, and also like the leader of like the good team, I guess. I don't know. Samuel L. Jackson's character is the leader of the good team, while Bryan Cranston's character is the leader of the bad team. Got it? Got it. Oh yeah, by the way, as I mentioned, the name of Samuel L. Jackson's character in this movie is Alfie. Ellie has a cat, a really bad CGI looking cat named Alfie. Isn't that inconvenient? Don't worry. It gets better. It gets so much better. And so Ellie meets up with her parents in this other hotel, and this is where we get another plot twist, and if the plot twists ended here, then everything would be fine. But nope, they just keep getting worse and worse and worse. As it turns out, Ellie's dad is Bryan Cranston's character, the main villain of the movie. That alone is a good plot twist, and if the movie stopped with that, then it would be fine, but nope, it keeps going. It keeps on going. Aiden appears trying to rescue Ellie from her parents, subsequently shooting Ellie's mom in the process. And the two of them manage to escape to a vineyard in France where they meet Alfie. And it's there where we get the big plot twist surrounding this movie. Everything that Ellie writes about in her book Sirius happened to her in real life. Her name is not Ellie Conway, it's Rachel Kyle, aka R. Kyle. Very clever movie, very clever. As it turns out, Ellie, Rachel, whatever, was a spy, much like Argyle himself. And then, this movie does something that I have never seen any other movie do. It retcons a plot twist with another plot twist. As it turns out, Ellie, Rachel, whatever's parents are not actually her parents. Bryan Cranston's character, the main villain of the movie, is not her dad, despite what was established earlier. This movie set up a huge plot twist earlier on, and now it's just completely undoing it, completely retconning it for seemingly no reason, other than to make the movie's storyline even more bloated and confusing than it already is. I'm guessing like an accident happened to Rachel that caused her to end up in the hospital, where you have the two fake parents come in. You have Bryan Cranston's character, and then you have the fake mother. I don't remember her name. I don't remember the actress's name. I don't care either, honestly. This movie sucks. And then they essentially lie to her. They claim that they are her parents, and they give her all of these different like lies and stuff, convincing her that she was never a spy. She had a completely different life, and the thing that caused her to end up in the hospital was a figure skating accident. After finding out about this, Rachel and Aiden set out to get revenge on Rachel's fake parents. And that's where the first movie ends. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I'm looking forward to that sequel. Oh wait, I forgot. We're still going on. This would have been a good point to end the movie, and then just have the rest of the movie be a sequel. That would make this plot easier to understand. It would give you more time to digest, to process everything that goes on in this movie. But nope, this is all just one movie. This movie started off as being about a book, by the way. Just friendly reminder, keep that in mind. So the two of them head to this like palace in the middle of nowhere. I don't remember why, and I don't care either. And then as it turns out, in another plot twist, Rachel's fake mom is alive. She was wearing a bulletproof vest when Aiden shot her. Isn't that inconvenient. The two of them end up on this ship where they try to transfer like these files, I don't know, to Alfie. I don't remember at all. Okay, this movie is confusing as hell. There's a scene where Rachel shoots Aiden and seemingly joins the villain's side briefly, trying to give the files to her fake parents. And then it's just like out of nowhere, it's like, nope, actually she was pretending, which, you know, I kind of get that. I kind of see what the movie was trying to do, you know? She pretends to be on the villain's side briefly, but it's so badly executed when you combine that with the millions and millions of plot twists that are in this movie. As I mentioned before, Rachel shoots Aiden, but Aiden manages to survive because, get this is the most stupid thing I've ever heard in my entire life. Get this. So there's a character in the Argyle book series that seemingly dies after getting shot. At one point, Ellie gets an email from a fan suggesting a concept where, as it turns out, plot twist, this character survives. Thanks to this very specific thing where it's like, if you shoot a bullet into the heart, it's like there's a very small hole where the bullet can go through and it doesn't shoot at the heart. It doesn't hurt the heart or anything like that, and you don't die, so you could still survive. I don't know, it's really stupid. It's also worth noting that when Rachel was a spy, in addition to working with Aiden and Alfie, she also worked with this other woman who unfortunately died, with this woman acting as an unintentional inspiration for the girl that gets shot in the Argyle book universe. Keep that in mind. That's going to be important information. So Rachel and Aiden try to transfer these files to Alfie. They end up stopping Bryan Cranston's character. He dies. Like, he dies for real. There's no bullcrap plot twist where it's like, oh no, as it turns out, he managed to survive his death. He managed to fake his death, and so he moved to Albuquerque to start a new life, becoming a high school chemistry teacher. There's nothing like that at all. His character is dead. Just like that, permanently. The two of them end up going outside in order to try and transfer these files to Alfie. And at this point, you're over here like, oh my god, finally this movie's about to end. Please be over, please. And then Rachel's fake mother appears out of nowhere and she says like a bunch of random words and she's holding up a music box that's playing. And this causes Rachel to become evil and she starts fighting Aiden for some reason. I guess it's like brainwashing. I don't know. It's padding out is what it is. It's like, let's make this movie longer than it needs to be. This is a long movie. This movie is like 2 hours and 18 minutes when it has no reason to be this long. It is a 2 hour and 18 minute long movie and it gives you way too much to care about and not enough time to take in everything that goes on in it. Just as Rachel is about to end Aiden once and for all, someone knocks out Rachel's fake mom cold with a wrench, subsequently destroying the music box and snapping Rachel out. And as one final you to the audience of this movie, as it turns out, yet another plot twist, the person that stopped Rachel's fake mom was the woman that supposedly died. As it turns out, she was still alive. And as another plot twist, we get 2 plot twists in a row, because this movie doesn't have enough plot twists, clearly. She was the one that sent Rachel, Ellie, whatever, the email about the hole in the heart thing or whatever, how you could still survive getting shot in the heart. That email was sent from her. Absolutely wonderful writing. God damn. It's all so perfectly convenient, isn't it? Rachel finishes up the final book in the Argyle series and everyone lives happily ever after. The end. Oh yeah, did you guys forget this movie started off as being about a book? Because I sure as hell did. So you think that's it? That's the end of the movie. Well, as it turns out, no. That's not the end of the movie. Now, I have to bring up that some of you may know Matthew Vaughn for providing the Kingsman film series. Now, I've got to admit, I have never seen the Kingsman movies. I don't know if they're good or bad. I've heard the first Kingsman is a really good movie, but then the sequels are hit or miss in comparison. They're not as good. They cannot be any worse than Argyle. That's for sure. We cut to a post-credits scene that takes place at the Kingsman bar. I don't know. The scene supposedly takes place 20 years earlier. 20 years before what? I don't know. It can't be 20 years before the events of the movie we had just watched because it won't make much sense, and you're gonna see why in a little bit. But anyways, it's here at the Kingsman bar where we see a significantly younger Argyle. And just like that, this movie has the gall to give us a sequel tease. Argyle Book 1, which is supposed to be an in-universe movie adaptation of one of the Argyle books. Okay, first of all, you don't make a sequel and name it Book 1 because that's going to confuse audiences. People are going to look at Argyle and then they're going to look at Argyle Book 1, and they're going to ask, which one's the first movie? Which one do I watch first? Furthermore, I have to ask, why didn't they just do this from the f***ing beginning? Why didn't they just make an in-universe movie adaptation of one of the books? Instead of this weird meta bullshit where it's like, everything that happens in this fictional book happened to this fictional author in real life, in the fictional real life that this movie takes place in. Also, great idea connecting this to the Kingsman movie franchise because, you know, clearly this movie isn't f***ing bloated enough already. You think that's it? Well, get a load of this. Matthew Vaughn intends on making this a trilogy of movies. Not only that, but he also intends on making a connected universe, a cinematic universe, if you will, with the Kingsman franchise, the Argyle franchise, and a third currently unknown franchise. All I'm gonna say, Matthew Vaughn, is good f***ing luck getting any of this stuff to happen. This movie, unsurprisingly, did very poorly critically and commercially. This movie received very bad reviews from critics, and it ended up being a box office flop. This movie had a staggeringly high budget of $200 million, and it couldn't even make $100 million. Wow. Even if this movie was good, there was no chance for it to be a successful movie at the box office. It's a comedy, and it's an original story. And in 2024, both of those things are a big no-no when it comes to box office success. But it's the extra added fact that this movie is god-awful that just makes it even less surprising that, yeah, this movie flopped. And it just makes me question, where the hell did this budget go? Most likely it's because of the massive star-studded cast that the movie has. As I mentioned before, Rachel has a cat named Alfie, and for some reason in every scene, I repeat, every single scene that this cat is in, it's very obviously CGI, which I have no idea why they decided to do that. When it's like an intense action scene, it's like, yeah, okay, it makes sense to use a CGI cat, obviously. You wouldn't want to use a real cat, god no. But then you have a scene like this where you have Alfie jump up next to a table next to Aiden, and it's like, really? You couldn't get a real cat for this scene? Why not? The CGI for the cat is also not very good either. You could very obviously tell that it's CGI, but that's beside the point. Just looking at the very bloated, cluttered nature of this movie's storyline, and it's like, yeah, it's not surprising at all that this movie had a $200 million budget, and it's even less surprising that this movie flopped. I don't know how much sense this is gonna make, but this movie has development hell written all over it. You could have told me this movie was in development since, I don't know, 2009, and I would believe you. What do you mean development only started in 2021? What do you mean this movie did not go through any sort of development hell? The extremely confusing and bloated nature of this movie, the cluttered all over the place scattered ideas that are in this movie's storyline say otherwise. I mean, yeah, most likely this movie's development was affected by both the pandemic and the 2023 strikes, but That's not the same thing as development hell. Again, I have to make parallels between this movie and Megalopolis, which actually did go through development hell, and it very much shows. I could very easily imagine Matthew Vaughn writing down the screenplay for this movie, hoping that people would find the movie clever, hoping that people would find this movie to be a work of art, hoping that people would consider him a genius, just putting in all of these different plot elements, putting in all of these different plot twists in an attempt to have this movie be seen as smart and clever, in an attempt to have him be seen as a subversive genius, something like that. And it's like, buddy, listen to me. You're not Christopher Nolan, okay? You don't need to be Christopher Nolan in order to have your movie be considered good. You could have very easily just made a dumb, fun action comedy, something stupid but entertaining, and call it a day, and I promise you, nobody, I repeat, nobody would get mad at you for making a movie like this in this day and age. This should be the least pretentious movie ever made, and yet it's not. This should be a perfect turn off your brain and have fun movie, and yet you are forced against your will to keep your brain on, because otherwise you're gonna have no idea what the hell is going on in this movie. I'm not watching an avant-garde Russian movie from the 1950s about World War I as told from the perspective of a dog. I'm watching a action comedy. Why is this movie's plot so hard to understand? Why? I'm not saying that comedies can't be smart or anything like that, because obviously, yes, comedies can be smart. It's very rare for a comedy to be smart, but yeah, smart comedies, they do exist. Not every comedy is a wacky, stupid, happy-go-lucky Adam Sandler, Jim Carrey slapstick fest. Obviously, yes, smart comedies do exist. The problem with Argylle, though, is that it has no reason to be a smart movie at all. It should just be a dumb, fun action comedy, and that's it. And yet, for some reason, it decides to go the extra mile in the worst possible way. Argylle is a stupid movie that desperately tries to be a smart movie, when it should instead just embrace the fact that it's a stupid movie. And ironically enough, the fact that it desperately tries to convince the audience that it's a smart movie only ends up making the movie even more stupid. And unfortunately for us, it's not the good kind of stupid. All I'm gonna say is, Matthew Vaughn better make the next Empire Strikes Back with this movie. This movie better be the modern day equivalent to Terminator 2 Judgment Day. I want to apologize heavily for how long this segment is, but it is impossible for me to talk about why this movie is bad without having it be extremely long. This is just a bloated, cluttered movie, and so naturally this is how it would turn out. It is impossible for me to make a simple 5-minute review saying this movie is bad. No, this movie wants me to go into detail on why it's bad, and so I go into detail on why it's bad. And you want to know what the worst part is? There are still 2 movies remaining on this list. Their respective segments might not be as long as Argyle's segment, but they are far more painful movies, if you can believe it. And so we move on to the final 2 movies on this list. Let us proceed. Number 2 serves as a reminder that, yes, we might be living in a golden age of video game adaptations, but the infamous video game curse still lingers on, and the following movie that we're about to talk about, I think, is the ugliest example of the video game movie curse yet. Number 2 is Borderlands. Now I'm going to admit something right off the bat. I have never played a single game in the Borderlands franchise. I know literally nothing about this franchise. I could not tell you a single thing about these games or its lore or anything like that. I am 100% unfamiliar with Borderlands as a game franchise. And yet, I still watch this movie, and I still think the movie is fucking awful despite that fact. Now, some of you might be wondering, why did I bother watching this movie if I've never played a single game in the Borderlands series? Good question. Well, you see, I saw that this movie debuted with a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, and that made me extremely curious to see how bad this movie was. And all I've got to say is, yeah, the movie is pretty damn bad. It is exactly as bad as the critics made it out to be. And the fact that I am completely unfamiliar with the source material should just tell you how bad this movie is. If someone like me that has never played a single game in the Borderlands series thinks this movie is awful, I cannot imagine what this movie is like to people that are actually fans of the Borderlands game series. I cannot imagine what that's like. I don't doubt that the Borderlands games are good. I have no idea. They are critically acclaimed, but I've also seen a lot of detractors for the franchise, so who knows how it'll turn out for me. But I feel like my opinions on Borderlands the game will have no effect on my opinions on Borderlands the movie. Simply put, this is the last airbender of video game movies, and I do not say that lightly. Whenever you think of the video game movie curse, you think of like a lot of like bad video game movie adaptations, and yeah, you know, they're not great movies, but some of these movies are not really as bad as people make them out to be necessarily. You look at the Mario, Street Fighter, and Mortal Kombat movies from the 90s, and it's like, yeah, they're not great movies, but they're at least fun. You can enjoy them. The 90s Street Fighter movie is cheesy as hell, and yeah, it's not very good as a Street Fighter movie, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't entertaining either. These aren't great movies, but at least you could have fun with them. There is no fun to be had with Borderlands. It is a completely joyless, miserable experience of a movie. I find it interesting how we went from a movie that had so many things wrong with it, and I mean so many things wrong with it, to a movie that is bad for one reason. But let me tell you something, this one reason is impossible to ignore when watching this movie. Again, I am not familiar with the Borderlands games, so I don't know if this movie is inaccurate to the games or not. I could not tell you at all. I am not the right person to tell you. I don't doubt the possibility that this movie has a lot of inaccuracies from the video game series. I don't doubt that there are a lot of things that are wrong in this movie when it comes to adapting the games, but I don't care how faithful this movie is to the original games or not, because there is one fatal flaw that ruins this movie, and that is the humor. Simply put, this is one of the unfunniest movies I have ever seen in my entire life. This movie is a perfect example of MCU humor at its absolute worst. At the very beginning, during the dishonorable mentions, I talked about Red One, and I briefly mentioned how MCU humor is a little bit weird in that sometimes it can be funny because of how unfunny it is, and other times it can be insufferable because of how unfunny it is. Red One falls into the former category. It's not a funny movie, but it is so unfunny that it somehow manages to turn around and become funny, but for the wrong reasons. This movie, in comparison, is a perfect example of the latter. It is insufferable how unfunny this movie is. I think Red One also has the advantage of having such a stupid, absurd storyline that it helps kind of add to the funny bad nature of the movie, whereas Borderlands is just Guardians of the Galaxy if it was bad. You watch this movie and it's very clear they're trying to copy the style of Guardians of the Galaxy, completely lacking everything that made those movies so good. It has the same sort of like misfit team thing, I guess. I don't know how to describe it, but I'm sure you know what I mean. You have all of these characters that have seemingly nothing in common with each other, and they're forced to team up together against their will. At first, they don't want to be together, but then as the movie progresses forward, they end up working together. They end up forming a friendship, I guess. I don't know. And they end up making a perfect team. This movie tries doing something like that, and it fails miserably. And that is largely because of how unfunny this movie is. I want to specifically focus on Jack Black's character, Claptrap, who I find to be particularly annoying in this movie. Again, I'm not familiar with the games, so I have no idea what this character is like in the original games, but holy shit, is this character annoying as hell in this movie. It's clear that this is supposed to be the comedic relief of the movie. He's supposed to be the comedic relief of the team. But God, every single scene that he's in, and he has a lot of scenes, I'm pretty sure like half of the movie consists of unfunny scenes from this character alone. And not once is it ever funny. Not once is this character ever funny. It feels like Jack Black is trying way too hard to make this character funny, and I mean way too hard. I almost want to laugh at any scene that this character is in, not because it's funny, but because I feel bad for the movie. That's the general vibe I get from this movie. This movie tries way too hard to make you laugh. It tries way too hard to be funny, and there's a part of you that wants to laugh at the movie, not because it's funny, but because you feel bad for it. You want to laugh at it out of pity. Either that, or you laugh at the movie not because it's funny, but because you're just desperate to laugh at something. This is a movie that desperately tries to make you laugh, but it's not funny, and so you start thinking of other things inside of your head, and that makes you laugh instead of the movie that you're watching. You're not laughing at the movie, you're laughing at something else you're thinking of in your head while watching the movie. And this is especially the case with the many, many unfunny scenes that Claptrap is in. And yet, despite all of this, I feel like Jack Black is the only person in the cast that's at least kind of trying. As I mentioned before, it feels like Jack Black is trying way too hard to make this character funny, but it also feels like he's the only one that's trying at all. Seemingly no one else is trying in this movie. It's like nobody wants to be in this movie. If I remember correctly, this movie went through some form of development hell, which is, third time's the charm, I guess. I think this movie was heavily affected by the pandemic, I'm not sure. To be fair though, this movie doesn't have the it went through development hell and it shows vibe that Megalopolis and Argyle had. I'm sorry, I refuse to believe that Argyle didn't go through some form of development hell. That's just impossible. There is no way development on Argyle started in 2021. I'm sorry, I refuse to believe that. But development hell or not, it doesn't matter because this movie is so insufferable with its comedy. It is so unbelievably unfunny. This movie is so bad, I wouldn't be surprised if there were people like me that are unfamiliar with the Borderlands game franchise and they were turned away by this series because of this movie. They refuse to play a single Borderlands game because of this movie. This movie suffers from what I like to call the has-been hotel effect, where it's like, this movie is a comedy, or at least it's trying to be a comedy, but then there are a few serious moments that are in this movie. So the main character of the movie, Lilith, I guess had a mom who died when she was a kid, and there's a scene late into the movie where she comes across an old hologram of her dead mom, and it's supposed to be like a sad moment in the movie, but the problem is you are unable to take it seriously because of how awful the humor is in this movie. You get reminded of how unfunny this movie is, and it completely ruins any chances of you taking this seriously. You look at the movie that Borderlands is very desperately trying to be like Guardians of the Galaxy, and you see like, yeah, Guardians of the Galaxy has funny moments in it, but it also has serious, sad moments in it as well, and you're able to take these slower emotional moments seriously because of how well the comedy is executed. I know that doesn't make much sense out of context. If the comedy in a movie is good, then that allows you to take the serious moments seriously. But would you take the emotional moments of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 seriously if the movie had the same style of humor as Thor: Love and Thunder? Exactly, that's what I thought. The Guardians of the Galaxy movies are some of the only MCU movies to not have the MCU-esque humor that the franchise is infamous for, and that allows you to take the emotional moments that are in these movies seriously. I've said this before and I'll say it again. If the comedy and the drama are both executed well, then you get to feel the respective emotions for both of them perfectly. You get to laugh at the comedy, and you get to take the drama seriously. When one aspect is done poorly, that affects the other aspect as well, regardless of how the other aspect is handled. If the comedy is done badly, then that ruins the drama, even if the drama is well executed, and vice versa. And then the movie also does the infamous thing where they have a sad moment and then they completely ruin it with an unfunny moment immediately after. So as it turns out, it's Claptrap that's providing the hologram of Lilith's dead mother, and as soon as it ends, we get more unfunny jokes from Claptrap, and God, it's like, they just don't want me to take it seriously, do they? Do you want me to take this seriously or not? Make up your in mind, please. When I finished watching this movie in theaters when it came out, I had to ask myself, was this the worst movie of 2024? I had to debate with myself, was this worse than the next movie on the list, or was it better? It was very hard for me to decide if this was the worst movie of the year or not, but ultimately, I decided to put this movie at number 2 for the simple fact that at least this movie has a couple mildly okay action scenes in it. There are a few action scenes in this movie that could be like 2% fun, I want to say. But mark my words, this is still an awful movie, regardless of if you're familiar with the Borderlands game franchise or not. I wish I was familiar with this game franchise because I feel like then I could go into more detail on why this movie is bad. I've seen a lot of people say that Cate Blanchett and Kevin Hart were miscasted in this movie, but I don't know anything about the original games. I don't know anything about the game version of these characters to verify that. I'm just going off of what I've heard. I don't know how faithful this movie is to the Borderlands games, but I feel like faithfulness doesn't matter when the movie is this f***ing unfunny. There is no fun to be had in this movie, plain and simple. If you ever wanted to know what Guardians of the Galaxy would look like if it had the same style of humor as Thor: Love and Thunder, this is the movie for you. All I'm gonna say is, please, for the love of God, let's not have history repeat itself. Please, God, please. And with that said, let us move on. Alright, so before we move on to number 1, I think it's fair that I give you a very quick recap of all of the previous movies that I've talked about on this list. Now, I am very well aware that this is a massive list, and I apologize for how long it is, but I do want to go into detail on why each and every single one of these movies were bad, and I feel like I've accomplished that. Before we move on to number 1, allow me to give you a quick recap of the previous movies that were talked about on this list. Dishonorable mentions go out to Red 1, Moana 2, Kraven the Hunter, and Y2K. And with that said, let us move on to the recap for the list proper. Number 15, Harold and the Purple Crayon. Number 14, Despicable Me 4. Number 13, The Crow. Number 12, Kung Fu Panda 4. Number 11, Madam Web. Number 10, Joker Folie à Deux. Number 9, Mufasa the Lion King. Number 8, Mean Girls. Number 7, Megalopolis. Number 6, Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate. Number 5, Saving Bikini Bottom, the Sandy Cheeks movie. Number 4, Emilia Perez. Number 3, Argyle. Number 2, Borderlands. And the number 1 worst movie of 2024 is Jerry Seinfeld's Unfrosted. Let me tell y'all a story, okay? Argyle was the first movie that I watched of 2024, and almost immediately after watching it, I proclaimed it to be the worst movie of 2024. And then I watched Madam Web, and then I considered that to be the worst movie of 2024. And then I watched Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate, and then I considered that to be the worst movie of 2024. And then I watched Unfrosted, and then I considered that to be the worst movie of 2024. Only this time, it stayed that way. Between all of the movies that I would watch between Unfrosted and the beginning of this list, None of them, not a single one of these movies managed to be as bad as Unfrosted. None of them managed to dethrone Unfrosted as the worst movie of the year. Borderlands came dangerously close, but again, it's slightly redeemed by having a couple mildly okay action scenes in it. Unfrosted has nothing like that. All of the Joker 2s and Mufasas that I would subsequently sit through would be nowhere near as painful of an experience as sitting through Unfrosted. After I finished watching this movie, I was certain, for sure, this was going to be the worst movie of 2024. And imagine my shock when, by the end of the year, this movie still remained the worst movie I had seen in 2024. This is a movie from comedy legend Jerry Seinfeld. Now, I'm sure everyone watching this is familiar with Seinfeld the show. One of the greatest TV shows ever made, and maybe the only worthwhile thing Jerry Seinfeld has ever been involved with in his career. Sorry, Barry. Here he is, making his directorial debut with Unfrosted, a fictionalized retelling on how Pop-Tarts were made. This movie was part of the seemingly short-lived brand biopic trend that was going on around 2023 to 2024. In my original review of Unfrosted, I brought up how this seemed to be like the next big trend, seeing how superhero movies were dying out, only for there to not be a single brand biopic released after Unfrosted came out. There's a non-zero chance that Unfrosted ended the brand biopic genre that briefly existed in 2023 and 2024. As with many of the other movies that are on this list, I rewatched this movie. I was especially dreading rewatching this movie more than any other movie on this list, considering the fact that, again, this is number one. This is the worst movie of 2024, and maybe one of the worst movies I've ever seen in general. For comparison, the worst movie of 2023 for me was The Flash. I would rather watch The Flash over Unfrosted. Easily. Hell, I would rather watch The Flash over half of the movies that are on this damn list, honestly. If you looked past the elephant in the room of Ezra Miller being a terrible person, The Flash is just a painfully generic by-the-numbers superhero movie. It's a tiny bit watchable, I guess. Not a lot, it's not very watchable. Again, worst movie of 2023, don't get me wrong, but it is a very, very, very tiny bit watchable, which is more than I could say for half of the movies that are on this list. Gun to my head, I would rather watch The Flash over Joker 2. I would rather watch The Flash over Argyle. I would rather watch The Flash over Megalopolis. I would rather watch The Flash over Emilia Perez, and I sure as hell would rather watch The Flash over Unfrosted. This movie is supposed to be a comedy. It is not funny in the slightest. This might be the unfunniest movie I have ever seen in my entire life. I don't know how much sense this is gonna make, but this movie is unfunny for very different reasons when compared to why Borderlands is unfunny. And somehow I think this movie is even unfunnier than Borderlands, if you can believe it. This movie is somehow unfunnier than MCU humor. How the do you manage to make something that's unfunnier than MCU humor? I just don't know how to elaborate on how this movie is unfunny. This doesn't feel like a movie from 2024. That's the most that I could say about it. In my original review for this movie, I claimed that this felt like a really kids movie from like the early 90s, but rewatching this movie, I got more of this like crappy early 2010s made for TV Nickelodeon Disney Channel movie vibe from this, except that this is somehow a Netflix movie from 2024 that is from a comedy legend, that is from someone who was attached to one of the greatest TV shows ever made. And you want to know the funniest thing? You want to know something that is funnier than any of the jokes that are in this movie? Around the same time this movie came out, Jerry Seinfeld claimed that comedy can't be edgy anymore because of political correctness. He criticizes, I guess you could say, wokeness for being the reason why comedy is dead. Comedy can't be edgy anymore. Well, Jerry, if you want to retaliate against wokeness ruining edgy comedy, don't release this shitty movie that has zero funny jokes in it. And it's full of the shittiest squeaky clean humor I've ever seen in a movie. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, it would make no sense at all if a movie about how Pop-Tarts were made had a lot of edgy, offensive black comedy in it. But on the other hand, I'm sorry, you cannot complain about how comedy can't be edgy anymore because of wokeness and PC leftists and whatever, and then you go on to release this fucking Disney Channel movie that will just do nothing but completely destroy whatever point you're trying to make. I'm sorry, Jerry, but as far as edgy comedy goes, this movie leans much closer to Zack and Cody than it does to Blazing Saddles. What the hell is this, Jerry? What the hell is this? If it weren't for the complete lack of feet jokes in this movie, I would have thought that this was some Nickelodeon TV movie from the early 2010s. There you go, Jerry. There's an edgy, offensive joke right there. Are you happy now? Ironically enough, I think Jerry Seinfeld himself would be highly offended at me making such a joke, considering the fact that he and Dan Schneider really aren't all that different at the end of the day. Boom, 2 offensive jokes for the price of 1, just like that. I don't know if this movie was made as a genuine pushback against wokeness ruining edgy comedy or whatever, or if it was just an ill-timed coincidence. But either way, there's just something beautifully ironic about the fact that, like, the man who made this movie claims that comedy can't be edgy anymore because of wokeness, and then at the same time he's saying that he releases this movie that's on the same level of quality as those live-action Fairly Odd Parents movies from the early 2010s. There's something just beautifully ironic about that. That is funnier than any of the jokes that are in this movie. I don't know how I didn't notice this when I first watched this movie, but upon rewatch, I find this movie to be highly corporate in its nature. This is a movie about Pop-Tarts, obviously. This movie heavily focuses on Kellogg's. Kellogg's are the good guys in this story. And so naturally, you have appearances from a lot of Kellogg's mascots: Snap, Crackle, and Pop, Tony the Tiger, Toucan Sam, etc. And I can't help but feel weirdly disgusted by how blatant this movie is when it comes to, like, buy Kellogg's products. This movie makes me want to go to the grocery store and buy Pop-Tarts, you know? It reminds me of a certain other movie that I watched for the first time recently. What's that movie called? Let me see. You've probably never heard of this movie. It's a very obscure movie. Let me think from the top of my mind. Oh yeah, it's called Food Fight. You've probably never heard of this movie. It's very obscure. I watched Food Fight recently for the first time. I made an entire video on Food Fight explaining why it's bad. I don't care if I just rehash what everyone else has already said about Food Fight. I made my own video on it. And rewatching this movie, I was amazed by how many parallels there are between these two movies. Both movies focus on food, obviously. Both movies are extremely shameless when it comes to their product placement. Both movies have really bad, really unfunny food-related puns in them. Well, in Unfrosted's case, it would be bad cereal puns, but, you know, that still fits. Both movies have a surprisingly big cast, I guess you could say. Unfrosted has Jerry Seinfeld in it, obviously. We've already established that. But also Amy Schumer is in this movie, playing the main villain. I already brought this up in the Unfrosted review, but I'm gonna bring this up again. For better or worse, probably for better, I am unfamiliar with Amy Schumer's work. I have never seen a single Amy Schumer movie, except for Unfrosted. I am very well aware that she has a reputation for supposedly being very unfunny, and watching this movie, I can verify, yeah, she is unfunny, but I feel like it doesn't really matter when every character in this movie is unfunny. I see no reason to single out Amy Schumer for being unfunny in this movie when literally every character in this movie is unfunny, but I digress. Dean Norris, best known for playing Hank Schrader in Breaking Bad, makes a cameo appearance in this movie, who plays like this Russian leader, Russian soldier, I don't know. It's a very quick cameo. He only appears in one scene and that's it. You would think because haha Breaking Bad, whatever, this scene would be a little bit funny, but unfortunately no. This is one of the unfunniest scenes in the movie, which is saying something. Much like with Food Fight, I have no idea who the target audience for this movie is supposed to be. For most of the movie, this is trying to be a kid's movie. This is trying to be like a kid's movie. The problem is, what kid is going to find this movie funny? This movie takes place in the early 60s, and so naturally there are a lot of references to early 60s pop culture, most of which will most definitely fly over the heads of any kid that watches this movie. Maybe the 60s pop culture references are for the parents to enjoy, I don't know, but at the same time this movie feels too immature for adults to enjoy it. And so once again, for the final time, I have to ask, who the hell was this movie made for? Who the hell is the target audience for this movie? I don't think this movie would appeal to Jerry Seinfeld fans, given the fact that this movie is nothing like the kind of humor that Seinfeld has. I know that Seinfeld the show is considered funny because of Larry David, the co-creator of the show, and not because of Jerry Seinfeld himself. But still, imagine being a fan of Seinfeld, the show, and then you see this new movie that has Jerry Seinfeld in it, and you're like, oh, I can't wait to see what this is like. And what you end up getting is this unfunny garbage that feels like it's for babies, but like babies won't enjoy this movie. Who the hell is this movie made for? To give you an idea of how unfunny this movie is, there's this running gag throughout the movie where you have these milkmen that spy on Jerry's house for some reason. I'm pretty sure they explain it in the movie, but like, I don't know, I wasn't paying attention. I was just too busy focusing on how bad the comedy in this movie is. And then it all culminates with one of the milkmen kidnapping Jerry and taking him to this barn where he's being interrogated by the leader of the milkmen, played by Peter Dinklage. So there you go, another big name that's just attached to this movie for some reason. And then it ends with Jerry being forced to walk down the aisle, which is basically just a bunch of cow butts. And there's a lot of farting noises and whatnot, and this is Jerry Seinfeld's idea of edgy humor. Just think about that. The man who made this movie, the man who put this scene into his movie, claims that comedy can't be edgy anymore because of wokeness and political correctness and whatever, which is why he decides to retaliate by making this movie that has this fucking iCarly tier humor in it that's disrespectful to iCarly. I apologize. And he just expects people to agree with the point he's trying to make. And instead, all he's gonna do is earn a lot of ridicule. Nobody is going to take his claim that comedy can't be edgy anymore seriously if he gives us this garbage. If I had never heard of Jerry Seinfeld before I watched this movie, and this movie was my introduction to his work, I would have a very, very hard time believing that in the 90s, this same man starred in what is widely considered one of the greatest, funniest, and most important TV shows ever made, even if he wasn't the reason why the show was good. I would just simply refuse to believe that. You could never be able to convince me that Seinfeld is a good, funny show, because that's how fucking bad this movie is. I would have been on Team Friends for Life by default, just like that. You would never be able to successfully convince me that this man was in something funny at one point in his career. Jerry Seinfeld claims that comedy is dead because of PC leftists. And if that's the case, then all I have to say is, Thank you, PC leftists, for ruining comedy. Yeah, we may never get any more movies like Napoleon Dynamite or Superbad in the future, but at least we will never get another movie like Unfrosted ever again, so, try and look on the bright side of things. Thank you, PC leftists, for ensuring that we will never get another movie like Unfrosted ever again, hopefully. I felt personally insulted watching this movie, just looking at how unfunny it is. And that's made even more insulting when you combine that with the whole thing of like, this doesn't feel like a 2024 movie, this feels like an early 2010s Nickelodeon TV movie, and then you add in the whole claim from Jerry Seinfeld that comedy can't be edgy anymore, which is really ironic because there are zero edgy jokes in this movie, and it's no surprise at all why this movie is number 1 on the list. Ladies and gentlemen, Unfrosted, the worst movie of 2024 and one of the worst movies I have ever seen, period. Thank you everyone for watching this entire list. I know that this is a very long list and I apologize for that, but again, I wanted to go into as much detail as I possibly could on why these movies are all bad. Now that I've finally completed this entire list, I can finally move on to making more smaller scale videos, maybe, potentially, hopefully, I don't know. Feels like a massive f***ing weight was just lifted off of my back, It feels really good, man. It feels really good. Anyways, that's about it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see y'all next time. Adios.